Hey heroes, and welcome to another supernatural episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelate. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. This week's tale begins with an ancient entity known as the Mother of Demons. Over the millennia, she has been known by over 20,000 different names, including Batzuge and Kiskilila, either of which could potentially be her original moniker, but in the modern age, she is best known as Lilith. I will note that she should not be confused with the daughter of the notorious vampire Count Dracula, who is also named Lilith but otherwise unrelated. In the case of the demonic Lilith, her true origins have evidently been lost since the dawn of humanity. By some accounts, she is the daughter of the Zoroastrian god of evil Ahriman. By others, she was originally an angel who served the Abrahamic god Yahweh as a member of the heavenly hosts. Along with her sister, Naamet, Lilith reportedly joined her husband, Samael, in an attempted rebellion against heaven, with Lilith personally leading 480 legions of angels into battle. Some sources indicate that this uprising was sparked by the creation of Adam, allegedly the first man, who Yahweh created from dust with the intent of allowing him dominion over the earth. When the rebellion failed, those who instigated it were cast down into various hell dimensions, and Samael reportedly went on to become one of the many demons to call himself Satan. Although I will note that in the modern day at least, Samael lacks the power and influence of others who have used the name Satan, such as Mephisto, Marduk, Kurios, and Lucifer, all three of whom are considered lords of hell, whereas Samael is not. Apparently recognizing that there was little future in staying with him, Lilith left her husband and instead courted Adam in the Garden of Eden. With Adam as her consort, Lilith birthed a number of demonic children known as the Mazikim, intending for them to rule the world. According to one version of events, Lilith regularly argued with the oppressive Adam, ultimately leaving him rather than allowing herself to be considered his lesser. A different story indicates that God himself intervened, banishing Lilith from the garden and sending her back to hell. In either case, the children that she'd had with Adam were slaughtered by angels, presumably including Senoi, Sansenoi, and Semengal. Of course, Yahweh then created for Adam what he considered a more suitable consort, Eve, who is regarded by Judeo-Christian creation myth as the first woman. However, Lilith conspired with the devil, presumably the demon Mephisto in this instance, and the two tricked Eve into eating the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and convincing Adam to do the same, thus disobeying a direct order from God. As a result, both Adam and Eve were banished from the Garden of Eden, but I'm sure most of you are already at least passingly familiar with that part of the story. Another account indicates that after leaving Adam, Lilith conceived numerous demonic children with Satan. However, the devil eventually grew bored of her and cast her out of hell once again. Of course, all of the above should be taken with a grain of salt, as stories from myth and legend are generally unverifiable, and any information revealed by Lilith herself is automatically suspect, as demons and devils of all kinds are known liars. For example, one story identifies Lilith as the first vampire, which is categorically untrue, at least in the Prime Marvel universe. However, she did reportedly live on the continent of Atlantis prior to its sinking in the Great Cataclysm 20,000 years ago, and may have been among the individuals who used the Chthon scrolls, later referred to as the Darkhold, to transform the ape-like sorcerer Varney into the actual versed vampire. At some point, she was opposed by a group of Atlantean mages who sealed her physical body within the remains of the legendary Leviathan Tiamat, but her disembodied spirit evidently escaped and continued to wander the earth, manifesting in different forms. After the fall of the Atlantean Empire and the torrential flood that swept across the planet, Lilith was apparently worshipped in ancient Mesopotamia as a member of the Anunnaki, but it's believed that she deteriorated into a type of wind demon called a Lilitu. These particular demons are known for wandering Sumerian deserts and seducing hapless young men who cross their paths in the dead of night. Other ancient and unverifiable stories involve her battling the eternal Gilgamesh, challenging the legendary King Solomon, clashing with the prophet Elijah, slaughtering the children of Job, and reigning over the ruins after the fall of Rome. Whether or not any of these myths are true, one thing we can glean from all of them is that throughout the millennia, Lilith has embarked on a quest to bear legions of powerful children, hence her infamous title, the Mother of Demons. To this end, she has seduced, coerced, or otherwise tricked both allies and enemies into carnal encounters, allegedly including King Solomon, the angel Shemhazai, the prophet Elijah, the fertility deity Attis, the Olympian skyfather Zeus, and perhaps even the Judeo-Christian god Yahweh himself. This reportedly resulted in the creation of several demonic races, including succubi, incubi, and the jinn. The most notable of her children, however, are the Lilen, a race of demons whose members each possess their own unique superpowers, and followed Lilith in a campaign to dominate humanity. But with no shortage of adversaries, Lilith was evidently banished back to hell, and many of her children were killed. Most notably, the Lilen were opposed by the Order of the Midnight Suns, which was made up of flaming warriors known as Spirits of Vengeance, mortals who were granted a vestige of God's power to avenge the innocent and cleanse the world of evil. These spirits eventually sacrificed themselves in a battle with the demon Zarathos, but for that story you can refer to my video on the Ghost Riders, linked in the description. In the meantime, a number of Lilens survived, and while some hid among humanity, many others fled to a dimension known as the Shadow Side. In the centuries since her disappearance from the Earth, legends of Lilith's independence and rebellion against Adam's oppression made her a mythic heroine to many, but there were some, like the Sorcerer Supreme, who were aware of her destructive nature. Then, in the modern age, the Leviathan corpse used to bind her physical form was found by a scientific expedition in northern Greenland. Seizing upon this opportunity, Lilith performed a mystic ritual that freed her spirit from hell, allowing her body to draw strength from the emotions of the explorers and complete her resurrection. Using the Leviathan's entrails in a divination ritual, Lilith identified 9 fated successors to the Order of the Midnight Suns, and scried them slaughtering her children. Intent on stopping these new Midnight Suns from assembling, she summoned her son, Pilgrim, who had the power to open teleportation rifts, and the two set out to gather more of the Lilen. Aware of the situation but unable to confront Lilith directly, Dr. Strange began to manipulate things from behind the scenes to ensure that the 9 were brought together before the Mother of Demons could eliminate them. So, for the next part of this week's video, let's take a moment to introduce each of the 9. First up, we have the modern-day successors to the Spirits of Vengeance, John Blaze and Daniel Ketch, whose complicated origins and connection to the previous spirits were explored in a previous video. During the time of Lilith's resurrection, Blaze was no longer bonded to the demon Zarathos and thus could not transform into a Ghost Rider, but he did have the ability to channel hellfire through his shotgun, allowing him to fire devastating bursts of mystic flame. Daniel Ketch, meanwhile, became the new Ghost Rider by channeling the spirit of his ancestor, Noble Kale, but when Danny's human form was fatally wounded by his nemesis Blackout, he was forced to remain permanently trapped in Ghost Rider form to save his life. Next, we have Morbius, the living vampire. I'm sure most of you are at least passingly familiar with him as a recurring Spider-Man antagonist and occasional anti-hero. He is referred to as a living vampire because while he has many vampiric traits, he is not actually undead, and his origins are scientific in nature rather than supernatural. We've also talked about him on the channel before, so check the link in the description for more details. Next, we have a trio of vampire hunters collectively referred to as the Nightstalkers. The most famous of these is Eric Brooks, better known as Blade, who I'm sure needs no introduction. His mother, Vanessa Brooks, was bitten by a vampire, Deacon Frost, shortly before giving birth to him in the early 20th century. As a result, Vanessa died in childbirth while Blade was born a Dhampir, a partial vampire. Granted a greatly increased lifespan and immunity to supernatural vampire bites, Blade spent the following decades becoming the world's most skilled and prolific vampire hunter. One of his allies in this profession was a man named Frank Drake, who was actually a descendant of the notorious vampire lord Count Dracula. While born into considerable wealth, Drake evidently squandered the majority of his inheritance after the death of his father Jonathan. When he learned that he'd received ownership of the legendary castle Dracula as part of his inheritance, his friend Clifton Graves suggested that he monetize it as a tourist attraction, and the two men traveled there with Drake's fiancée, Jeannie Ovington. Once there, Graves plotted to betray Drake with the intention of stealing both the property and the girl for himself, but as he explored the depths of the castle, he came upon Dracula's remains, which had been sealed in place by a wooden stake. Disbelieving the legends about Dracula's vampiric nature, Graves pulled the stake free to use in his own schemes, but as we discussed in our video on vampires, it's virtually impossible to permanently kill Dracula, and once the wooden stake was removed from his chest, the vampire lord was able to quickly regenerate and revive. Dracula threw Graves into the castle's dungeon, later using him as a human thrall, and vampirized Jeannie Ovington, forcing Drake to subdue and ultimately slay her. In the wake of this ordeal, Drake contemplated ending his own life, but his attempt to do so was interrupted by a pair of vampire hunters, Rachel Van Helsing and Taj Nital. If the name Van Helsing sounds familiar, it's because Rachel's family has had a long history of fighting vampires, with her great-grandfather Abraham Van Helsing being one of the men who opposed Dracula in the late 1800s, an incident that was famously recounted by the Irish novelist Bram Stoker. Drake agreed to join Rachel and Taj and began learning how to hunt vampires himself. He also worked with Rachel's mentor, Quincy Harker, whose parents, Jonathan and Mina Harker, were also involved in the infamous incident recounted in Stoker's novel. Suffice it to say, Drake gained plenty of occult experience during this time and became an accomplished vampire killer in his own right. It was also during this time that he first met Blade, and while the two occasionally butted heads, they were ultimately on the same side. Their war with Dracula seemingly came to an end when Quincy Harker sacrificed himself to slay the vampire lord once again. In the midst of all of this, there was something of a romance between Frank Drake and Rachel Van Helsing, but her obsession with her family mission prevented her from ever settling down, even after Dracula's defeat, and the two eventually broke up. Rachel was later vampirized by a resurrected Dracula and forced to serve him, but when the vampire lord was subsequently defeated by the X-Men, Rachel Van Helsing convinced Wolverine to give her a merciful death. After that, Frank Drake started seeking therapy, however his doctor, Gregor Smirnoff, was secretly being influenced by the demon Asmodeus, who plotted to revive Dracula yet again. As part of this scheme, Smirnoff introduced Drake to a woman named Marlene McKenna, who possessed latent psychic abilities. Those of you who watched last week's video should be familiar with such individuals, but according to Dr. Smirnoff, the odds of any one person having the potential to develop psionic powers is roughly 1 in 30 million, but even then most never unlock this potential. In any event, his scheme ultimately involved sacrificing the souls of 666 such people to revive and empower the vampire lord. As Smirnoff worked towards this goal, McKenna and Drake fell in love, and within a year of meeting, the two became husband and wife. The whole situation started coming to a head when Smirnoff caused Marlene McKenna to be possessed by the spirit of Rachel Van Helsing, leaving her confused and disoriented to the point of insanity. Smirnoff then manipulated Marlene/Rachel into helping resurrect Dracula, and the vampire lord subsequently killed Smirnoff, having no future use for him. In any event, Frank Drake joined forces with Blade to oppose Dracula once again, and in the end Marlene McKenna Drake was restored to normal. Drake subsequently worked with a computer technician named Silicon Valley to develop a new weapon called the Exorcist, which used nanotechnology to harness and channel occult energies, the combination of which was referred to as Necrotech. Drake and Silicon playfully nicknamed this weapon Linda, after the actress Linda Blair. Next we have a vampire hunter who is also a vampire himself, Hannibal King. Prior to the Marvel Age, he was an ordinary private investigator, but while working on an industrial espionage case, he had a run-in with Deacon Frost, the same vampire responsible for Blade's origin. This encounter ended with Hannibal King being turned as well. However, King was able to resist his vampiric urges and continued operating as a private eye while satiating his bloodthirst with animals, blood banks, and corpses. After his transformation, he took a keen interest in cases involving the occult, which led to his own encounters with Dracula and other vampires. During this time, his primary goal was to find and defeat Deacon Frost, a quest that soon caused him to come face-to-face with Blade, who of course sought the same thing. While they initially butted heads due to King's vampiric nature, the two ultimately joined forces in their hunt, during which time they were attacked by a Blade doppelganger created by Frost that merged with and took control of the real Blade. This evil Blade was subsequently killed by Dracula himself. However, Hannibal King later joined forces with the son of Satan, Daimon Hellstorm, to resurrect Blade and free him from the influence of his dark doppelganger, restoring him to normal. After that, Blade and King finally tracked down Deacon Frost, and after fighting their way through more evil doppelgangers, successfully destroyed their mutual foe and completed their vengeance. In the wake of this, despite being a vampire himself, Hannibal King earned Blade's respect and friendship. Those two later joined forces with Frank Drake, and the trio formed an investigation firm called Borderline Investigations. For the next member of the Chosen Nine, we turn our attention towards an Italian woman named Vittoria Montesi. Her story really begins with the Chthon Scrolls, which contained ancient magic and arcane knowledge originating from the Elder God of Chaos and etched onto indestructible parchment. As mentioned earlier, it was this magic that was used to transform the Atlantean wizard Varney into the first true vampire, among other evils. The majority of these scrolls were eventually collected by the sorceress Morgan Le Fay and bound into a single volume known as the Darkhold. The status of this book changed throughout history, as there were times when the pages were separated and scattered, only to be subsequently collected again. In the 12th century, the pages were obtained by the Catholic Church, and a young monk named Paolo Montesi discovered that he was capable of reading the scrolls without succumbing to their corrupting influence. In his studies, Montesi discovered a passage that would later be referred to as the Malachi prophecy, after being attributed to the Irish saint. One section of this prophecy spoke of, quote, a child born of no man and of a woman marked by sin, end quote, which was actually a cryptic warning of Chthon's rebirth. Hoping to keep their evil from spreading, Pope Eugene III declared that the Darkhold Scrolls be once again bound into a single volume, referred to by the Church as the Book of Sins. Furthermore, Montesi was given special dispensation to marry and to sire heirs, so that his family line could serve the Church as custodians of the Darkhold. This duty was passed down through the generations, although the book itself was stolen from the Vatican in 1459 and changed hands numerous times after that. It was lost by the master sorcerer Alessandro di Cagliostro and later found by his estranged son Taboo, before winding up in the possession of the lycanthropic Rusoff family in the early 20th century. By this point, however, multiple pages and passages had been transcribed, copied, or otherwise kept separate from the book itself, some of which were still in the possession of the church. During this time, custodianship of these documents had passed to Father Giuseppe Montesi, who evidently bore no children of his own. Meanwhile, Giuseppe's brother Vittorio learned that he was sterile, and, desperate to continue the bloodline, looked to the scrolls for answers. Using a fertility spell from the Darkhold, Vittorio Montesi impregnated his American wife, who gave birth to a daughter, Victoria. Little did he realize, but in doing so, Vittorio was actually fulfilling a piece of the Malachi prophecy by facilitating the birth of a woman marked by sin, as Victoria Montesi was actually the daughter of Chthon. While not knowingly aware of this, Vittorio sensed Victoria's true nature on a subconscious level, and the two wound up resenting each other, seemingly because she could never be the son that he wanted. Feeling neglected by the man she thought was her father, Victoria rejected Vittorio's teachings and religious beliefs, and began attending medical school with the intent of becoming a doctor. Their strained relationship only got worse when Victoria came out as a lesbian and moved in with her girlfriend, a karate instructor named Nash Salvato. While Victoria was disowned by her family in the wake of this, she did maintain a good relationship with one of Vittorio's associates, a woman named Louise Hastings. Born in Barbados but living in England, Hastings was a professor of archaeology at Oxford, a knowledgeable expert in the world of the occult, and another of the prophesied 9 successors to the Order of the Midnight Suns. Speaking of which, the last of the 9 we have yet to introduce is a man named Samson Buchanan. Now, not much is known about his past, aside from the fact that he was a talented Interpol agent who had some experience with the extra-normal. At some point he worked with the mutant Sabretooth on a mission in the Falklands, and while the details of that incident are undocumented, it apparently ended poorly, leaving bad blood between the two. There's not much else to say about him, honestly, so now that the players have all been introduced, let's get down to brass tacks. Things really got started when the Ghost Rider had a vision of Lilith's return and shared it with John Blaze. As mentioned earlier, Lilith intended on preventing the 9 from assembling and began gathering Lilen, who were still on Earth, including Danny Ketch's enemy Blackout, who was actually a descendant of the Lilen race. She sent him and a Lilen named Creed to defeat John Blaze by taking his wife and children hostage. However, this was foiled by Blaze and the Ghost Rider, and Creed was beheaded in the battle. Blaze's ally, a psychic named Clara Menninger, then directed the two back to New York and to a woman named Martine Bancroft, the former fiancée of Michael Morbius. Hoping to cure Morbius of his pseudo-vampirism, Bancroft contacted a doctor named David Langford and provided him with Morbius's unpublished notes. Langford plotted to betray Bancroft by killing Morbius and profiting from his research. However, this plan went sideways when the Lilen known as Fang, who could transform his body into a shapeless mass, also attempted to poison the living vampire by adding his own blood to the serum. This new concoction caused Morbius to begin mutating further, strengthening his vampiric qualities, but he ultimately survived, meaning that one of the Lilen ironically saved his life by sabotaging the procedure. Complicating matters further, Langford was working with a mad doctor known as Dr. Payne, who was displeased with his failure, and so when Martine Bancroft learned of his schemes, an already panicked Langford shot and killed her. Not long after that, Morbius killed Langford in retaliation and took a sample of the chemical concoction that had been used on him. Ghost Rider and Blaze confronted Morbius directly afterwards, but agreed not to get in his way as long as he only ever drank the blood of the guilty. Next, Lilith attempted to eliminate Victoria Montesi by convincing a group of Darkholder cultists that Montesi was a threat to the Book of Sins itself. The cultists then planted a bomb in her apartment, and while Victoria survived the explosion, her girlfriend Nash was severely injured and forced to live in a convalescent hospital. In the wake of that attack, the Vatican pulled strings with Interpol to have Agent Sam Buchanan assigned to protect Montesi. In the ensuing investigation, these two were also joined by Victoria's ally, the occult expert Louise Hastings. While all of that was happening, a mysterious servant of Cthon, known simply as the Dwarf, obtained a number of missing Darkhold pages and began giving them to people on the pretense of solving their problems. One such individual was a man named Donald Walsh, who desired immortality, but was transformed into a living swarm of chameleon worms. These uses of the Darkhold caused Victoria Montesi to be stricken with terrifying visions, and so she, Buchanan, and Hastings formed a group called the Darkhold Redeemers to oppose the dwarf and other followers of Cthon. In the ensuing battle with Walsh's chameleon worms, the Redeemers were aided by Blaze and Ghost Rider, who recognized Hastings from his visions. After that incident, by disguising herself as a human client, Lilith tricked the trio of Blade, Frank Drake, and Hannibal King into attacking Blaze and the Ghost Rider, by claiming that the supernatural heroes were actually demons. Suffice it to say that scheme failed as well, and the two groups ultimately joined forces against a larger threat, albeit with lingering enmity between them. Thus, the prophesized 9 successors to the Order of the Midnight Suns were finally ready to oppose Lilith together. This situation came to a head when Doctor Strange teleported the heroes to the site of Lilith's resurrection in Greenland to confront her and her children. Using her own body as a gateway, Lilith summoned the disembodied spirit of the Ghost Rider's human host, Daniel Ketch, transforming him into a Lilen as well. But in the end, this was undone, and the Ghost Rider defeated Lilith by partially forcing her through her own portal, causing a mystic explosion that seemingly banished the Lilen back to the Shadow Side dimension. With the battle at an end, Doctor Strange arrived to explain his role in what had happened, and to send the heroes back from whence they came. However, Lilith survived, and in the wake of the conflict emerged from the snowy wastes along with several of her children. Weakened but alive, she began regaining her strength by consuming the Lilen who were still by her side, and plotted her eventual revenge on the Midnight Suns. But I suppose that'll have to wait for another day, because that is all I have time for this week. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!